The loudest sound in the world is not a scream of fury, but the silence of a heart that has finally stopped trying. It's in that quiet that the most meticulous plans are born, watered by tears the world never saw. In the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the mediation room, that silence was a living thing, thick and heavy between Richard and Eleanor Vance. The polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of their lawyers, men who traded in the currency of broken vows and divided assets. For Richard, this was merely the last tedious step before shedding the dead weight of his 15-year marriage. He adjusted the cuff of his $1,000 suit, a picture of corporate success and impatient victory, his gaze flicking between his Rolex and the woman who sat opposite him. Eleanor, his wife, soon to be his ex-wife. She was a statue carved from forgotten promises, her stillness a stark contrast to his restless energy. There was no trace of the vibrant, brilliant woman he had once courted, only a placid emptiness that he mistook for defeat. The mediator droned on, his voice a bland instrument meant to soothe, but the tension in the room could shatter glass. They were discussing the final settlement, a document Richard's legal team had drafted to be both insultingly minimal and legally airtight. He was giving her the house, a respectable alimony for a few years, enough to be seen as generous, but not enough to maintain the life he had built. It was a golden cage, and he was finally setting himself free. Growing impatient with the legal jargon and her infuriating calm, Richard leaned forward, his voice a low, condescending hiss meant to cut her one last time. "Just sign the papers, Eleanor." His words sliced through the room's fragile peace. "Let's be honest, you're useless without my money. What are you going to do? Go back to arranging flowers?" The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. The mediator cleared his throat. They all expected tears, a final, broken plea. They did not expect what happened next. Eleanor's gaze, which had been fixed on a point just beyond Richard's shoulder, slowly lowered to meet his. And then, a change so subtle it was almost missed. The corners of her mouth lifted into a faint, serene smile. It was not a smile of forgiveness, nor of sadness. It was the smile of a chess master who sees the board, not just for the next move, but for the checkmate 10 moves away. In that moment, Richard felt the first cold prickle of a fear he couldn't name. Her silence was no longer the silence of surrender. It was the quiet intake of breath before the storm, the profound and terrible calm of a tidal wave gathering its strength far out at sea, ready to reclaim everything in its path. To understand the woman who sat in that room, the one who met her husband's cruelty with a cryptic smile, you have to understand the woman she had been. Richard's question, laced with the casual poison of a man who believes his own lies, was more ironic than he could ever comprehend. Go back to arranging flowers? It was a pathetic caricature, a role he had written for her and forced her to play for 15 years. But before she was Eleanor Vance, the perfect corporate wife in the sprawling Greenwich estate, she was Eleanor Pierce, a name once spoken with a mixture of awe and envy in the roaring heart of Wall Street. They didn't call her Eleanor then. They called her the Oracle on the 34th floor. She was a quantitative analyst with an almost supernatural ability to see the music in the market's noise. While others saw chaotic numbers, Eleanor saw patterns, narratives, the subtle rise and fall of greed and fear. She had a mind like a diamond, sharp and multifaceted, capable of cutting through the dense fog of financial speculation to find the hard, glittering truth. She joined a boutique investment firm as a junior analyst, and within 3 years, was managing their most volatile emerging markets fund. She wasn't a gambler, she was a strategist of the highest order, and her plays were legendary for their audacity and precision. It was during this ascent that she met Richard Vance at a charity gala. He was handsome, ambitious, and radiated a confidence that matched her own. He was in real estate development, a world of concrete and steel, a tangible counterpoint to her abstract world of algorithms and market projections. He was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her mind. In those early days, he would listen for hours as she explained the intricacies of her work, his eyes wide with genuine admiration. He saw her as an equal, a partner, a queen to build an empire with. When he proposed, it was with a promise of a shared throne. The decision to leave her career was entirely her own, a calculation made with the same careful consideration she gave any multi-million-dollar investment. She saw a future with children, a family, a life beyond the frantic energy of the trading floor. She believed she could apply her intellect to a different kind of system, one of love and legacy. She didn't see it as giving something up. She saw it as diversifying her portfolio into something with deeper, more lasting returns. For the first few years, the returns were magnificent. She ran their home not as a housewife, but as the COO of Vance Family Holdings. Every aspect of their lives was optimized with quiet efficiency. The children's educational paths were mapped out with the foresight of a long-term investment strategy. The family finances were managed with a precision that would make a Swiss banker weep. Even the dinner parties she hosted were masterclasses in social engineering, subtly positioning Richard in front of the right people, creating connections that would later become lucrative deals. She was the silent architect of his success, the invisible foundation upon which his real estate empire was built. Richard would come home, exhausted from a day of negotiations, and everything would be perfect. The children would be happy and thriving, the house an oasis of calm, his favorite single malt waiting for him. He grew accustomed to this perfection. He began to see it not as the result of relentless, intelligent work, but as the natural state of his world, something he was simply entitled to. The shift was gradual, a slow poisoning of the respect he once held. It began with small omissions. When introducing her to new business partners, he started saying, "This is my wife, Eleanor," and leaving it at that. The brilliant analyst from his anecdotes disappeared, replaced by a beautiful, silent accessory. Then came the jokes, first in private, then in public. "Eleanor handles the soft side of our life," he'd say with a chuckle, "while I deal with the real world." Each laugh from his audience was a small cut, bleeding the respect from their marriage. He stopped asking for her opinion on his deals, dismissing her insights with a wave of his hand. "It's a bit more complicated than the household budget, darling." The more successful he became, the more he needed to believe he had done it all himself. Her past brilliance became an inconvenience to his narrative, a footnote he was eager to erase. Pouring gasoline on this slow-burning fire was his mother, Margaret Vance. A woman whose bloodline was as old as her money, Margaret had never approved of Eleanor. To her, Eleanor was a clever upstart, a working woman who lacked the proper pedigree. When Eleanor left her career, Margaret saw it not as a sacrifice for family, but as a confirmation of her own beliefs. The woman's place was in the home, supporting the man. Margaret's praise for her son was always a backhanded slap at Eleanor. "Richard, you work so incredibly hard to provide all this for your family," she would say at dinner, her eyes sweeping over the immaculate dining room as if Eleanor were just another part of the decor. She would give Eleanor gifts of expensive cookbooks and gardening shears, subtly reinforcing the domestic box she had placed her in. "It's so important to have hobbies," she'd say, her tone implying that Eleanor's days were otherwise empty. Over the years, her constant whispers in Richard's ear that he was the sole creator of their wealth, that Eleanor was lucky to have him acted like water on stone, eroding the last remnants of the partnership they once had. Richard, high on success and coddled by his mother's adoration, began to believe it. He forgot the woman who could command a boardroom with a single sentence. He saw only the woman who arranged the flowers on the mantelpiece. And so, he called her useless. He had no idea that the quiet, meticulous CEO of his household had simply shifted her focus. She had stopped managing his life and had started planning his demolition, using the very skills he had taught himself to forget she ever had. The decay of a marriage, like that of a great house, does not happen overnight. It begins with a small, unnoticed crack in the foundation, a loosening of a single tile, a persistent draft in a once warm room. For Eleanor, the drafts had been blowing through their 15-year marriage for the better part of 2 years. They were the late-night phone calls Richard would take on the stone patio, his back turned to the house, his voice a low, intimate murmur she hadn't heard directed at her in years. They were the sudden, urgent business trips to cities that had no strategic importance to his real estate portfolio. He would return with a generic gift for her and the children, and the faint, unfamiliar scent of a floral perfume that clung to his travel blazer, a scent too delicate and modern to be found anywhere in her own collection. His excuses became smoother, more polished, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who tells lies so often they have become his native tongue. The distance between them grew from a crack to a chasm, an empty space in their king-sized bed that felt colder and wider than any ocean. The discovery, when it came, was not the result of a frantic search driven by suspicion. It was an act of domestic routine. Her son, Leo, had a school project about family history, and he needed a specific photograph from a vacation they had taken to Lake Como a decade earlier. Eleanor remembered storing their old digital backups in Richard's home office, a room that had increasingly become his private fortress. He had insisted on its privacy, claiming he needed a clear separation between work and home, but the truth was that he was walling off a part of his life. As she searched through a drawer filled with outdated chargers and tangled cables, her fingers brushed against a small, sleek external hard drive she didn't recognize. It was cool to the touch, black and anonymous, unlike the clunky, labeled drives they used for family photos and documents. A flicker of her old analytical instinct, the part of her that noticed anomalies in vast seas of data, ignited in her mind. It didn't belong. With trembling hands, she carried the small device to her own study, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She told herself she was being foolish, that it was probably just a backup of some tedious architectural renderings. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was wrong. She plugged the drive into her laptop, the soft click of the USB port echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. The drive was labeled simply RV Projects. A few of the folders were innocuous, filled with market research and building schematics she recognized. But one folder stood apart, named Project Nightingale. It was password protected. Her mind raced. Nightingale. A type of bird. A singer, Sophia. Richard had mentioned, weeks ago, that his partner, Sophia Sterling, was a talented amateur singer. It was a long shot, a desperate guess born of intuition. She typed in Nightingale 77. Access denied. She tried again, thinking of Richard's vanity. Sophia and Richard. Access denied. Then, a cold, bitter thought. What was the one thing he valued most? The name of the first skyscraper he ever built, the one that made his name. Vance Tower 01. Access granted. The screen that opened before her was a digital tombstone for her marriage. The first files she clicked were images. Hundreds of them. Richard and Sophia in Paris. A trip he claimed was a solo investor meeting. They were kissing under the Eiffel Tower, his arm wrapped around her possessively. Richard and Sophia on a yacht in the Caribbean, her in a bikini, him looking at her with an adoration he hadn't shown Eleanor in a decade. There were videos, too, intimate and undeniable, fragments of a vibrant, passionate life he was living entirely without her. The pain was physical, a white-hot blade twisting in her gut. She saw Sophia clearly for the first time, not as the polite, sharp young woman at company parties, but as a predator, her eyes glittering with ambition and triumph. But the personal betrayal, as devastating as it was only the first layer of the rot. As she numbly clicked through subfolders, her horror curdled into ice-cold fury. There were spreadsheets, legal drafts, and copies of bank statements that made her blood run cold. Her old analyst's mind, dormant for 15 years, roared back to life, processing the information with terrifying speed and clarity. Project Nightingale was not a building, it was a conspiracy. The documents laid out a detailed plan to leverage their shared marital assets, the Greenwich estate, their joint stock portfolio, the children's education funds as collateral for a massively high-risk commercial development in Dubai. It was an off-the-books venture, channeled through a series of shell corporations designed to be untraceable. The true venom was in the fine print. The profit structure was designed to funnel every single dollar of potential gain into a secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account name was listed in black and white on a scanned application form, Richard Vance and Sophia Sterling. And the liability structure? It was crafted with a lawyer's cruel genius to ensure that if the high-risk project failed, as it very well could, all the debt, all the catastrophic losses, would fall directly onto the Vance family trust. He was gambling their entire world, the security she had sacrificed her career to build, for a new life with his mistress. If he won, they would be rich beyond measure and disappear together. If he lost, he would declare bankruptcy, protected by corporate shields, while Eleanor and their children would be left homeless, saddled with a debt so crushing they would never recover. It was not just infidelity, it was an execution. He was planning to financially annihilate her and his own children. Eleanor did not scream. She did not weep. She sat perfectly still as the last vestiges of love and hope for her marriage turned to ash and blew away. The pain was still there, a deep, tectonic agony, but it was now overlaid with something else, something harder and infinitely more dangerous: purpose. She was no longer a betrayed wife. She was a strategist whose enemy had just revealed his entire battle plan. With methodical calm, she purchased the most secure, military-grade encrypted storage device available for next-day delivery. When it arrived, she copied every single file, every picture, every video, every spreadsheet, every damning email. She created multiple backups, storing them in places Richard would never conceive of. Then, she wiped her computer's history, deleted the temporary files, and placed the small black hard drive back in the drawer, exactly as she had found it. She walked out of his office and back into her life, the mask of the serene, oblivious wife, perfectly in place. But behind her calm eyes, the oracle of the 34th floor was wide awake, and she was no longer forecasting the market. She was forecasting the utter and complete ruin of Richard Vance. In the days that followed her discovery, Eleanor moved through her life like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own happiness. The sprawling house, once a symbol of her family's success, now felt like an elaborate crime scene. Every object held a new, sinister meaning. The framed photo on the mantelpiece of her, and Richard smiling on their wedding day, was a monument to a lie. The king-sized bed they shared was a cold, empty battlefield. She would lie beside him at night, feeling the warmth radiating from his body, the body of a man who was a complete stranger to her, and she would feel nothing but a profound and chilling emptiness. The love had been surgically removed, cauterized by the sheer, calculated cruelty of his betrayal. There was no rage, no screaming desire to confront him. A direct confrontation was a novice's move, an emotional outburst that would achieve nothing but giving him the opportunity to hide his tracks, destroy evidence, and paint her as the hysterical, unstable wife. The analyst within her, now fully awake, knew that in a war of this magnitude, the element of surprise was everything. Her silence was not weakness, it was camouflage. Her grief was a quiet, private thing. She mourned the man she had married, the partner she had loved, and the future she had believed in. She processed it all in the silent hours after midnight, not with tears, but with a cold, clarifying resolve. When the sun rose, she would pack the children's lunches, help them with their homework, and discuss dinner plans with the housekeeper, her composure a flawless mask. But behind the mask, her mind was working, assembling the pieces of a puzzle far more complex than any market trend she had ever analyzed. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed more than just a divorce lawyer. She needed a weapon, and she knew exactly who to call. Mr. David Chen was a legend in the world of corporate and financial law, a man in his late 60s with a mind as sharp as a shard of glass and a reputation for unparalleled discretion. He was a master of the game, a quiet, unassuming man who had dismantled corporate titans and humbled billionaires with little more than a fountain pen and an encyclopedic knowledge of the law's darkest corners. Years ago, when Eleanor was just starting out, Mr. Chen had been a senior consultant for her firm. He had recognized her talent early on, acting as an informal mentor, occasionally sharing a cryptic piece of advice that would unlock a complex problem. He was the only person from her old life who had seen the full scope of her abilities, and the only one she knew who possessed the moral flexibility and strategic genius this war would require. She didn't call him from the house phone. She bought a cheap, disposable burner phone from a convenience store 2 towns over. She created a new, anonymous email address at a public library. Her message to him was brief and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Chen, it's Eleanor Pierce. I require your professional counsel on a complex financial matter. My discretion is absolute, and I expect the same. I will be at the Hatcher Building, Suite 405, tomorrow at 2 p.m. She chose a neutral location, a shared office space she could rent by the hour, a place with no name and no memory. When he arrived, Mr. Chen was exactly as she remembered. Dressed in a perfectly tailored but understated charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes calm and observant, revealing nothing. He greeted her with polite professionalism, his demeanor suggesting he was expecting the standard story of a wealthy wife blindsided by an affair, seeking a comfortable settlement. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "I was sorry to hear from you under these circumstances. Perhaps you can start by telling me what kind of resolution you are hoping for." Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she opened her sleek laptop, attached the encrypted drive she had prepared, and turned the screen towards him. On it was not a gallery of her husband's infidelity, but a single, complex spreadsheet mapping out the network of shell corporations Richard had created. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice steady and devoid of pity. "I didn't ask for this meeting to discuss alimony or child support. I'm here because my husband is engaged in what I believe to be systematic fraudulent conveyance, asset stripping, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. And I need your help to stop him." For the next hour, she spoke. She didn't recount the story of a broken heart. She presented a corporate analysis of a hostile takeover. With the precision of a seasoned litigator, she walked him through the evidence. She showed him the falsified loan applications, the forged signatures, the illegal leveraging of their family trust. She traced the flow of money from their joint accounts to the shell corporations and finally to the undeclared offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. She had even prepared her own valuation of the Dubai project, highlighting its absurd risk profile and identifying the specific clauses in the loan agreements that Richard had used to defraud his investors and ultimately his own family. The change in Mr. Chen was remarkable. He began the meeting leaning back in his chair, a picture of detached counsel. Within 10 minutes, he was on the edge of his seat, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the data. The polite mask fell away, revealing the keen, predatory intellect beneath. He stopped seeing a jilted wife and started seeing the ghost of Eleanor Pierce, the brilliant prodigy he had mentored all those years ago. He began to interject, not with sympathetic murmurs, but with sharp, technical questions. "This transfer here, was it timed to avoid the quarterly tax filing? Have you tracked the IP addresses on these email exchanges?" She answered every question instantly, providing data points and cross-references she had already prepared. The turning point came when she finished her presentation. Mr. Chen was silent for a full minute, looking at her with a newfound, profound respect. "This is the most thorough case of pre-litigation discovery I have ever seen from a client," he said, his voice now laced with genuine admiration. "Most lawyers wouldn't uncover this with a year of work and a court-ordered subpoena. You've done it in a week from your study." "I haven't told you my plan yet," Eleanor said quietly. Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "You have a plan?" "I don't just want to expose him in a divorce court, David," she said, using his first name for the first time. "A divorce is a battle. I want to win the war. He thinks my world is the home, the garden, the children. He's forgotten the world I came from. I want to use his own arrogance, his own greed, and the market he operates in to dismantle him piece by piece. I don't want to just take half of his assets. I want to be the one who owns them." A slow smile spread across Mr. Chen's face, a smile of pure, intellectual delight. The lawyer was gone, and the strategist had emerged. "My God, Eleanor," he breathed, a gleam in his eyes. "You haven't lost your touch. You've been sharpening it into a knife." In that quiet, anonymous room, an alliance was forged. They were no longer just a client and a lawyer. They were architects of a downfall, and the first blueprints were being drawn. The storm inside Eleanor had passed. Now, in the dead calm, she was learning how to build a tsunami. The most audacious plans are built not on grand gestures, but on a foundation of overlooked details. For Eleanor, the first brick in the foundation of her new empire was laid with an asset so old and seemingly insignificant that Richard had forgotten it even existed. Before her marriage, Eleanor Pierce had her own brokerage account, a portfolio she had built with her first few bonuses. It was her private creation, a collection of daring, well-researched investments in fledgling tech companies that most of the market had dismissed as fantasies. When she married Richard, the portfolio was worth a respectable, but not life-changing sum. Richard, whose world revolved around tangible assets like steel and glass, had glanced at the statement once and chuckled, calling it her little hobby money. He never asked about it again. For 15 years, that account lay dormant, a digital time capsule of the woman she used to be. One quiet Tuesday morning, while Richard was at a board meeting and the children were at school, Eleanor sat down in her sunlit study, the room Richard condescendingly called her crafting nook, and logged into that account for the first time in over a decade. The password, Oracle34, brought a faint, bittersweet smile to her lips. As the page loaded, her breath caught in her throat. The numbers that stared back at her were staggering. A few of the companies had failed, as expected, but several of the others, the ones she had held onto with a stubborn belief in their vision, had not just grown, they had exploded. A small investment in an obscure online bookseller was now a significant holding in a global e-commerce titan. A stake in a quirky search engine startup had multiplied 1,000-fold. Her little hobby money was now a formidable war chest, a liquid fund of several $1 million that was entirely hers, clean, untraceable, and completely off Richard's radar. It was the seed capital for her resurrection. Her first call was to Mr. Chen. The plan they devised was elegant in its complexity and beautiful in its anonymity. They would create a holding company, a legal entity so opaque it was practically a ghost. Mr. Chen, with his network of international legal contacts, established a corporation in Delaware, which was in turn owned by a trust in Switzerland, which was managed by a nominee director in the Cayman Islands. It was a labyrinth of legal firewalls, and at its center was a single, powerful secret. Eleanor was the sole, silent beneficiary. They needed a name for this phantom entity, and Eleanor chose one that resonated with the fire now burning in her soul: Phoenix Holdings. From the ashes of her old life, something new and powerful was about to rise. With Phoenix Holdings established and funded, Eleanor began to move. She operated with the silent, deadly precision of a predator. Her strategy was simple: stay out of Richard's world. Real estate was his domain, a place where their paths might cross. So she turned her gaze elsewhere, to the frontiers he ignored and disdained. She delved into the worlds of biotechnology, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence, sectors that required the kind of deep, data-driven analysis that had once been her specialty. The 15 years she had spent away from the market had not dulled her instincts, they had sharpened them. Unburdened by the institutional groupthink of a large firm, she was free to follow her own brilliant intuition. Her new life became a masterpiece of camouflage, a secret war waged from the most unassuming of fronts. Her useless domestic routine became her greatest asset. The hours she spent at the Greenwich Garden Club were no longer about hybrid tea roses. She would sit in the back of the meeting, a large sun hat shielding her face, nodding politely at discussions of soil acidity while discreetly reviewing quarterly reports from a gene-editing startup on a tablet hidden behind a catalog of rare orchids. An urgent call from a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley was taken in the humid quiet of the club's greenhouse, her low, authoritative voice masked by the gentle dripping of the irrigation system. "Increase our position by 7%, she'd murmur. "Their Phase 2 trial data is more promising than the market realizes." Then she would emerge, smiling, to compliment another member on her prize-winning dahlias. The endless charity functions she was expected to attend became her mobile office. While Richard was glad-handing politicians and laughing with fellow developers, Eleanor would find a quiet corner, ostensibly to rest her feet. In reality, she would be orchestrating a multi-million-dollar investment through an encrypted messaging app on her phone. Her vacant, melancholy expression, which everyone attributed to her crumbling marriage, was the perfect disguise for the intense concentration of a master strategist evaluating risk. They saw a woman fading away. In truth, she was coming into focus. Her own home was her primary command center. The crafting nook was retrofitted with technology Richard couldn't even fathom. Hidden inside a vintage sewing cabinet was a state-of-the-art, encrypted workstation with a direct, secure satellite internet connection. Each morning, she would set up her multiple monitors, and the quiet room would transform into a trading floor. She conducted video conferences with CEOs and analysts across the globe using a professional-sounding pseudonym, Miss Evelyn Pierce, her voice altered by sophisticated software. She was a ghost in the machine, a disembodied intelligence with a rapidly growing fortune. An hour before Richard was due home, the entire setup would vanish, replaced by spools of thread and fabric patterns. When he'd poke his head in, he'd see his wife quietly mending a tear in their son's blazer and feel a familiar wave of pity and contempt. This new life was more than just a means to an end. It was a reclamation. With every successful analysis, with every profitable trade, she was rebuilding the woman Richard had tried to demolish. The work reawakened a part of her soul that had been dormant for years, the fierce, brilliant core of her that thrived on challenge and strategy. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving to herself, after years of being told she was nothing, that she was, in fact, everything. One afternoon, she closed a particularly successful deal, having quintupled her initial investment in a solar energy company. The profit was substantial, enough to buy a building in one of Richard's own developments. She leaned back in her chair, the scent of lavender from the garden drifting through the window, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of profound, unadulterated power. Richard saw a gardener tending to her roses. He had no idea she was cultivating an arsenal. While the fires of Phoenix Holdings burned brightly in the secret corners of her life, the public persona of Eleanor Vance continued its carefully orchestrated decline. She became a master of feigned fragility. In Richard's presence, she was a specter of their shared past, her eyes often distant, her posture slightly stooped, as if carrying an invisible weight. She would let her sentences trail off, feigning a loss of thought, a cognitive fog that Richard and his mother readily diagnosed as the onset of a deep depression. Her performance was convincing because, in a way, it was rooted in a genuine sorrow, not for the man Richard was, but for the man she once thought he was. This curated weakness was the most crucial part of her strategy. It made Richard feel powerful, intelligent, and, most dangerously of all, safe. A confident predator is a careless predator, and as Eleanor faded into the background of his life, Richard and Sophia grew bolder, their conversations more reckless, their digital tracks more brazen. Eleanor knew the evidence on the hard drive was a powerful weapon, but it only documented the plan. To truly seal their fate, she needed proof of the ongoing conspiracy. She needed to capture their actions and conversations in real time. The crafting nook, her sanctuary of domestic hobbies, transformed into an intelligence-gathering station. Her first acquisition was a simple piece of hardware, a keylogger that looked like a generic USB-C adapter. One evening, under the pretense of tidying Richard's chaotic home office, she plugged it into the back of his desktop computer, a tiny, silent parasite on his digital life. Within hours, it began to upload every keystroke to her secure server. She now had the passwords to everything: his personal email, his social media, and most critically, the encrypted portal he and Sophia used to manage Project Nightingale. Her next tool was a marvel of miniaturization, a voice-activated audio recorder no bigger than a paperclip. She knew Richard often took sensitive calls in his car during his commute, believing it to be a cone of absolute privacy. The next morning, as she wished him a good day, she leaned in for a kiss on the cheek, a gesture so rare now it momentarily surprised him, and with a practiced, fluid motion, she magnetically attached the tiny device to the metal frame underneath his driver's seat. The trap was set. The most dangerous part of her plan involved his phone, the device that was a digital extension of his very being. She needed more than just call logs. She needed the content of his encrypted messages, the location data, the voice notes. After days of research, she found a powerful piece of cloning software, but it required a brief, one-time physical connection to the device. This was the highest risk maneuver, a single point of failure that could expose her entire operation. Her chance came on a Saturday morning. Richard was in their master bathroom, taking one of his long, self-indulgent showers. She knew she had at least 15 minutes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped into their bedroom. His phone was on the nightstand, charging. With hands that she willed to be steady, she connected a small, specialized cable between his phone and her laptop. The software interface appeared on her screen, cloning in progress. A progress bar began to crawl across the screen with agonizing slowness. 5%, 10%. The sound of the shower was her metronome, each beat counting down her window of opportunity. Suddenly, the water stopped. Her blood ran cold. He was getting out, far earlier than usual. She glanced at the screen. 78%. Panic seized her. For a fleeting second, she considered aborting, but she knew she might never get this chance again. 85%. She could hear him moving around, toweling off. 92%. The muffled sound of the bathroom door opening. 99%. With a soft chime, the screen flashed. Complete. She ripped the cable out, shoved the laptop under the bed, and pocketed the cable just as Richard walked into the bedroom, a towel slung around his waist. He stopped, looking at her with mild suspicion. "What are you doing?" he asked. Eleanor held up her hand, showing him the back of an earring. "Oh," she said, her voice a pitch higher than she wanted. "I was just looking for this. I think it rolled under the bed last night." Her performance was flawless. He grunted, accepting the explanation, and walked to his closet, completely unaware that his entire digital life now belonged to her. The evidence she collected over the following weeks was a cascade of criminality. The keylogger gave her access to emails where Richard and Sophia discussed bribing a Dubai official to get their project permits fast-tracked. The audio recorder in his car captured a damning phone call where Richard laughed with his lawyer about the ironclad clauses that would protect him personally while leaving the family trust, and by extension Eleanor, liable for all the debt. "She won't know what hit her," he had chuckled. "By the time her book club friends figure it out, I'll be on a beach with a new life." But the cloned phone data was the crown jewel. She read their text messages, filled with cruel jokes about her mental state and their shared excitement for their future. She listened to voice notes Sophia sent Richard, outlining how to manipulate a key investor by feeding him falsified revenue projections. It was all there, a day-by-day, minute-by-minute account of their greed and deceit. Eleanor sat in her command center late one night, the glow of the monitors illuminating her face. On one screen was a live feed of Richard's email. On another, a transcript of his latest phone call. On a third, a folder containing hundreds of files. Audio clips, text logs, bank transfers, incriminating documents. She was no longer just a woman seeking justice. She was a prosecutor building an airtight case. Each piece of evidence was a single, shimmering thread of silk. Alone, each thread was fragile. But woven together, they created an intricate, inescapable web. Richard and Sophia were still flying free, drunk on their own arrogance and perceived success. They had no idea that all around them, in the silent, digital world, a patient spider had just finished her work and was now simply waiting for the perfect moment to pull it tight. Confident that Eleanor was a spent force, a ship already taking on water and destined to sink, Richard decided it was time to scuttle the vessel for good. He was the one who filed for divorce. The papers arrived not with a shout, but with the quiet finality of a courier's knock on a Tuesday afternoon. The thick manila envelope felt cold in Eleanor's hands. Inside, couched in the sterile, emotionless language of the law, was a document that was nothing short of a declaration of war. It was a masterpiece of fiction, painting Richard as the long-suffering husband, forced to make this painful decision due to his wife's tragic and irreversible decline. It cited her profound emotional withdrawal, increasingly erratic behavior, and an inability to fulfill her duties as a partner and mother. He was not divorcing her, he was putting her out of her misery. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was taking their shared history, everything she had built and sacrificed, and twisting it into a narrative of her failure. Holding the papers, Eleanor felt a flicker of the old, raw pain, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold fire of her resolve. This document wasn't an ending. It was the starting gun. With the legal filing came a coordinated and vicious psychological assault. Richard and his mother, Margaret, began a systematic campaign to assassinate her character within their carefully curated social circle. The narrative was consistent and devastating. Poor Eleanor had simply cracked under the pressure. She was unstable, ungrateful, perhaps even unwell. Margaret was the primary agent of this poison. Eleanor, through the audio files she now received daily, became a secret audience to her own vivisection. She listened to Margaret's syrupy, concerned tones on the phone with their friends. "We're all so worried about her," Margaret would sigh. "Richard has the patience of a saint, but he can only do so much. The children, they need stability." Richard played his part perfectly, the noble victim. At the club, he would deflect questions with a somber shake of his head. "I'd rather not talk about it. This is a private pain. I just want what's best for Eleanor and the kids." The effects were immediate and isolating. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. Friends who had once been her confidantes now crossed the street to avoid her, offering only a tight, pitying smile if eye contact was unavoidable. She was being erased, rendered a ghost in her own community. The isolation, which was designed to break her, instead became her shield. In her solitude, she was free to work, to plan, to become the architect of her retribution without distraction or the need for performance. The most agonizing front in this war was the one waged for the hearts and minds of their children, Lily and Leo. Richard, using his vast financial resources as a weapon, began a campaign of fun parent bribery. While Eleanor was at home, maintaining routines and a sense of normalcy, Richard would sweep in for his weekends and shower them with extravagant experiences. There were helicopter rides over Manhattan, front-row tickets to sold-out concerts, and impromptu trips to luxury resorts. He framed these extravagances as necessities. "Mommy needs her rest," he'd tell the children with a conspiratorial whisper. "She's going through a tough time, so Daddy's here to make sure you still have some fun." He never explicitly criticized her, which made his manipulation all the more insidious. He positioned her as the source of sadness and boredom, and himself as the escape into a world of excitement. The children, caught in the middle, were understandably confused. They still loved their mother, but the allure of Richard's world was a powerful narcotic. Then came the financial squeeze, the move Richard believed was his checkmate. He saw money as the ultimate expression of power, and he was determined to make Eleanor feel utterly powerless. It started when her credit card was declined at the grocery store as she was buying ingredients for Leo's birthday cake. The cashier's mix of pity and annoyance was a public humiliation designed to sting. The next day, an email arrived from his lawyer formally stating that all joint accounts had been frozen. From now on, she would be provided with a weekly allowance, deposited into a new account in her name only. The amount was a calculated insult. It was just enough to cover basic groceries and gas, but not enough for household maintenance, the children's extracurricular activities, or a single personal luxury. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to come to the mediation table broken and desperate, ready to sign anything he put in front of her. The irony was a spectacle only Eleanor could appreciate. One afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table, meticulously sorting coupons and creating a budget to make the allowance stretch. A portrait of the destitute wife Richard imagined her to be. An hour later, she was in her crafting nook, which was now her global headquarters, closing out a position on a biotech stock that had just received FDA approval. The single transaction netted Phoenix Holdings, a profit that could have paid her humiliating weekly allowance for the next 50 years. She authorized the trade with a calm click of the mouse, her mind a fortress of clarity. The juxtaposition was no longer jarring. It was simply the reality of her new, bifurcated life. She endured it all. The social shunning, the whispers, the financial deprivation. She absorbed every blow with a quiet, unnerving grace. Richard saw this as the calm of surrender. He had no idea it was the calm of a sniper in a hidden nest, watching her target move deeper into her crosshairs. Every lie Margaret told on the phone was a time-stamped audio file. Every manipulative text Richard sent to the children was screenshotted and archived. The formal email detailing her allowance was a pristine PDF. His every act of cruelty, every attempt to grind her down, was not an injury. It was evidence. He thought he was writing the story of her tragic collapse. In reality, he was meticulously authoring his own indictment, and Eleanor was simply taking dictation. The chess match had entered its middle game. The initial pieces were set, the lines of attack established. Richard, in his aggressive arrogance, had launched a full frontal assault on Eleanor's queen, believing her to be the most powerful piece on her side of the board. He had no idea that while he was fixated on this public battle, Eleanor was quietly moving a pawn across the board, preparing it for the game's most devastating transformation. Her strategy was about to pivot from defense and intelligence gathering to a silent, audacious act of offense. It was a move so bold, so far outside the conventional rules of a divorce, that even Mr. Chen had initially labeled it breathtakingly perilous. The plan was born from the long nights Eleanor spent dissecting Richard's legitimate business, Vance Development. While Project Nightingale was his secret crime, his public empire was a gleaming testament to his success, crowned by his current flagship project, the Polaris Tower. It was a soaring monument of glass and steel, but Eleanor, with her analyst's eye, saw beyond the facade. She saw the massive, crushing weight of the debt that held it up. In her research, she discovered a critical vulnerability. Richard hadn't secured his financing from a conservative, slow-moving giant like Chase or Bank of America. He had been in a hurry, and his ego demanded terms that major banks wouldn't grant, so he had turned to a smaller, more aggressive boutique investment bank called Argent Capital. Argent specialized in high-yield, high-risk loans, and they were known in the industry for their predatory tactics and, more importantly, for their willingness to sell off their loan portfolios to improve their own cash position. Argent Capital was Richard's financial lifeblood, and Eleanor had just identified it as his jugular vein. In a secure video conference with Mr. Chen, she laid out her analysis. Argent is overexposed in the commercial real estate market, she explained, her screen shared to display charts and data points. Their stock has been underperforming for 2 quarters. They are under pressure from their own board to de-risk. Richard's loan is one of the largest single assets on their books. They'll see selling it as a victory, a way to instantly improve their balance sheet. Mr. Chen listened, his expression a mixture of awe and alarm. Eleanor, to acquire a debt instrument of this size, the due diligence, the capital required, and the risk of exposure is immense. If Richard gets even a hint that someone is making a play for his loan, he'll move heaven and earth to find out who at Island. He won't find me, Eleanor stated, her voice calm and certain. He's looking for a rival developer, a corporate raider. He's looking for a man in a suit, sitting in a boardroom. He will never, in a million years, think to look for a woman in a sun hat, sitting in a garden club. Thus began the shell game. Phoenix Holdings was the engine, but it could not be the face of the transaction. Mr. Chen engaged a highly respected and highly discreet debt acquisition firm based in London. This firm was hired by the Swiss trust that owned Phoenix, creating 2 layers of separation. The London firm, in turn, established a new, temporary shell corporation in Delaware for the sole purpose of this acquisition, named North Star Asset Management, a quiet, ironic nod to Richard's Polaris Tower. The true buyer, Eleanor Vance, was now buried under 4 layers of legal and geographic misdirection. She was a ghost. The negotiations were a masterclass in subtlety and patience. The London firm approached Argent Capital with an unsolicited offer. As Eleanor predicted, Argent was initially wary but intrigued. The negotiations dragged on for weeks. Lawyers exchanged encrypted documents, and teams of analysts crunched numbers. Every night, in her crafting nook, Eleanor would receive a detailed report from Mr. Chen. She would analyze the latest offer and counteroffer, advising him on the precise language to use, the exact pressure points to apply. She knew Richard's business financials better than he did himself, and she used that knowledge to inform her bidding strategy, exploiting weaknesses in the loan's covenants that only she would think to look for. The tension ratcheted up one evening over a silent, miserable dinner. Richard, agitated after a long day, tossed his napkin on the table. "You wouldn't believe the week I'm having," he grumbled, more to himself than to her. "Some ghost buyer is sniffing around the Polaris loan. Anonymous entity, bottom feeders. Probably one of my competitors trying to get a look at my books." He laughed, a short, humorless bark. "They have no idea who they're dealing with. My relationship with Argent is rock solid." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, but her face remained a mask of placid disinterest. She looked up from her plate, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. "Oh, that sounds stressful," she said, her voice soft and even. She then turned to her daughter. "Lily, tell me about your history project." The moment passed. Richard, receiving no engagement, went back to his phone, dismissing her as he always did. He had no idea he had just been speaking to the ghost buyer herself. Finally, after a month of grueling, round-the-clock negotiations, the deal was struck. North Star Asset Management would acquire the entire Vance development loan portfolio from Argent Capital. The price was staggering, a 9-figure sum. On the day of the closing, Eleanor sat in her quiet study, the scent of roses drifting in from the garden. On her laptop screen, she watched the secure transaction take place. With a series of keystrokes, she authorized the transfer of funds from Phoenix Holdings. The money flowed silently through the labyrinthine channels they had created, from Switzerland to London to Delaware, finally landing in the coffers of Argent Capital. Moments later, an encrypted message from Mr. Chan appeared on her screen. It contained a single, scanned document, the official, notarized transfer of debt ownership. It was done. The shell game was complete. Eleanor Vance, the woman living on a pittance of an allowance, the wife he called useless and was in the process of discarding, was now the primary, silent, and sole creditor to her husband's entire business empire. He was no longer just her unfaithful husband. He was her debtor. Every brick in his precious Polaris tower, every dollar of profit his company generated, was now ultimately owed to her. He lived, breathed, and worked entirely at her mercy. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been shattered and remade in her image. She was the storm he would never see coming, and she now held the lightning in her hands. For a month, the great beast of Richard's empire slumbered, unaware of the new master who held its leash. Having successfully acquired the debt, Eleanor did nothing. She allowed the silence to stretch, letting Richard's brief paranoia about the ghost buyer fade into the background noise of his busy, important life. He grew comfortable again, his arrogance resurfacing, his focus returning to two primary objectives: expediting his divorce from his unstable wife and furthering his secret, glamorous life with Sophia. This period of quiet was a calculated move by Eleanor, a strategic pause designed to lower his guard completely before she struck. A cornered animal is dangerous. A complacent one is a perfect target. The strike was planned with the precision of a military operation. In her study, Eleanor and Mr. Chen, communicating via a secure, encrypted video link, pored over the colossal loan agreement that now belonged to Phoenix Holdings. It was a dense, 100-page document filled with arcane legal jargon. To Richard, it was a formality he'd had his lawyers sign, and then forgotten. To Eleanor, it was an armory, and she was searching for the perfect weapon. She found it on page 73, buried in a subsection of a subsection. Clause 22C. It was a liquidity ratio covenant, a piece of boilerplate legalese that stipulated the borrower, Vance Development, must maintain a cash-on-hand reserve equal to a certain percentage of the total loan value. If the ratio dropped below the threshold for any reason, the lender had the right to demand a significant cash injection to rebalance it within 30 days. It was a clause almost never enforced by a friendly lender like Argent Capital had been. But North Star Asset Management, the cold and faceless new creditor, was not friendly. "This is it," Eleanor said, her voice a low hum of excitement. "We trigger an audit based on this clause." His recent expenditures on the Nightingale project, which are not part of this loan's collateral, have drained his cash reserves. I've run the numbers. He's in violation. Mr. Chen smiled. He'll see it as an aggressive, hostile move from a new player. He won't see your hand in it at all. It's perfect. The letter arrived on Richard's desk on a Wednesday morning. It was delivered by a special courier and written on the crisp, formal letterhead of North Star Asset Management. The language was cold, direct, and utterly uncompromising. It cited Clause 22C, stated that Vance Development was in technical breach of the covenant, and demanded an immediate cash injection of $25 million to be deposited into a reserve account within 30 calendar days. Failure to comply, the letter concluded, would be considered an act of default, at which point North Star Asset Management reserved its right to call in the entire outstanding loan of several $100 million, effective immediately. Richard's reaction, which Eleanor monitored through the audio bug in his office, was volcanic. He didn't just read the letter, he bellowed it. He roared at his CFO over the speakerphone, demanding to know who the hell North Star was. He threw a crystal paperweight against the wall, where it shattered with a satisfying crash. This was not the act of a calm, confident titan of industry. It was the impotent rage of a king who had just received a declaration of war from an unknown country. He spent the next week in a frantic scramble, calling every contact he had in the financial world. But the news was grim. His old friends at Argent Capital were suddenly unavailable. Traditional banks laughed at his request for a $25 million unsecured line of credit on a 30-day timeline. The walls, which he had believed were a fortress, were suddenly closing in. Desperation led him, as it always did, to Sophia. In a panicked, late-night meeting in his office, a meeting Eleanor attended as a silent, digital observer, he laid out the crisis. Sophia, ever the pragmatist, saw only one way out. It's a cash flow problem, Richard, not a value problem, she said, her voice a soothing balm on his frayed nerves. We have an asset he doesn't know about. An asset with enormous projected value. Nightingale? Richard's voice was hoarse. Sophia, it's all projections and leveraged funds. It's a ghost. There's nothing solid there yet. To present it as collateral, we don't have to present it to North Star, she countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We use it to get a short-term bridge loan from a smaller, hungrier lender, someone who won't ask too many questions. We create a new valuation for Nightingale, something that shows it as a near-complete, highly profitable venture. We use that to secure $30 million. We pay off North Star, and we buy ourselves time. Eleanor watched on her screen as Richard hesitated. She could almost see the war in his mind between the last shred of his business ethics and the yawning abyss of his desperation. His desperation won. Do it, he finally said. Create the documents. Make them look perfect. The trap, so meticulously laid, had been sprung. And Richard had just walked right into it, dragging Sophia with him. Over the next 48 hours, Eleanor's surveillance system captured a symphony of criminal fraud. She listened as Richard and Sophia directed a freelance graphic designer in Zurich to backdate and forge construction permits for their Dubai project. Her keylogger captured Sophia writing emails to a loan shark-like lender in Macau, attaching a prospectus for Project Nightingale that was a work of pure fiction, filled with falsified lease agreements and inflated asset valuations. Eleanor saved every file, every audio clip, every incriminating email. She now possessed a perfect, time-stamped, and irrefutable record of them actively conspiring to commit wire fraud and bank fraud. She had done more than just uncover his past sins. She had created the perfect storm, a high-pressure system of her own design, and had correctly predicted that he would try to fly through it using wings made of wax and feathers. She sat back in her chair, the glow of her monitors reflecting in her calm, steady eyes. The web was complete, the evidence was absolute, and the flies had eagerly wrapped themselves in the silk. The long, silent hunt was over. The time for judgment was about to begin. The fraudulent loan, secured through a web of lies and forged documents, flowed into Richard's accounts like a revitalizing poison. The $25 million was transferred to the North Star Reserve account, satisfying the demand with days to spare. In Richard's mind, a crisis had been masterfully averted. He had been tested by an unknown, hostile entity, and he had emerged victorious. The experience didn't humble him. It inflated his already colossal ego to new, dangerous heights. He felt invincible, a titan who could bend the rules of finance to his will. His swagger returned, more pronounced than ever. He laughed on the phone with Sophia, toasting their brilliance. They had stared into the abyss and hadn't even blinked. Now, with his business empire secure, only one trivial piece of housekeeping remained, finalizing the erasure of his wife. Riding this wave of supreme confidence, he instructed his lawyers to draft a final, non-negotiable settlement offer. It was an act of profound contempt disguised as magnanimity. The document, when it arrived in Mr. Chen's secure inbox, was less a legal proposal and more a list of spoils granted by a conquering king to a vanquished foe. Eleanor would receive the Greenwich house, which Richard now considered an albatross of suburban boredom. She would receive her current 5-year-old SUV, and she would be granted a one-time, lump sum payment. The number was designed to look impressive on paper, enough to make an ordinary person gasp, but Eleanor knew it represented less than a single percentage point of their true combined net worth, much of which was hidden in ventures like Project Nightingale. The offer came with venomous strings attached, a permanent waiver of any future claims on Vance Development or any affiliated entities, and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that would legally gag her for life. Mr. Chen forwarded it to Eleanor with a simple, 2-word message: the bait. Richard, however, needed one final act of personal dominance. He couldn't resist the urge to hear her surrender. He called her on her personal cell phone, his voice oozing a patronizing warmth that was more insulting than his anger. "Eleanor," he began, as if speaking to a slow-witted child, "I trust you've seen the offer. I told my lawyers to be generous. For the sake of the children and for everything we once had, I want to make sure you're comfortable." Eleanor listened, her silence a blank canvas onto which he could paint his own narrative of victory. She stood in her kitchen, looking out at the garden she had spent 15 years tending, the roses in full, glorious bloom. "Take the deal, Eleanor," he continued, his voice hardening slightly, the velvet glove slipping to reveal the iron fist. "Sign the papers. Don't be foolish and try to fight this in court. You have no idea what you'd be up against. That world, it would eat you alive. You're not built for it anymore." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air before delivering the final, fatal blow to her perceived worth. "Frankly, you wouldn't know what to do with real money anyway. Just take what's on the table. It's more than you could ever earn on your own. Buy some more flowers." This was the moment, the final, perfect crystallization of his contempt. He saw her as a decorative, financially illiterate child, incapable of comprehending the world he inhabited. The analyst, the strategist, the silent power behind Phoenix Holdings, smiled faintly. She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting him savor what he believed was his ultimate triumph. Then, her voice, calm, and even as a frozen lake, came through the line. "I have received the offer, Richard." A pause. "I'll see you at the mediation." She ended the call before he could respond, leaving him momentarily bewildered by her lack of emotion. But his ego, ever his most reliable advisor, quickly supplied the answer. She was broken, resigned, a hollowed-out shell. Her quietness was the sound of defeat. In the final days, as Richard celebrated his imagined victories, Eleanor engaged in the quiet, meticulous work of preparing for a war that was already won. There was no joy in her work, no giddy anticipation of revenge. There was only a cold, focused purpose. Mr. Chen's office, working under her direction, had compiled her months of surveillance into a series of devastatingly precise dossiers. They were bound in simple, professional black covers. Exhibit A, Conspiracy to Defraud, Project Nightingale. Exhibit B, Wire and Bank Fraud, Macau Bridge Loan. Exhibit C, a pattern of psychological and emotional abuse. Each one was a tombstone filled with dated transcripts, audio files, forged documents, and a clear, damning narrative of his crimes. She met with Mr. Chen one last time. They didn't discuss legal strategy. They choreographed a detonation. They decided the sequence of revelations, the precise moment to present each piece of evidence, the exact words she would use. It was a script for the final, brutal act of a tragedy of Richard's own making. That night, the eve of the mediation, Richard took Sophia to a Michelin-starred restaurant to celebrate the closing of their fraudulent loan and the imminent end of his marriage. They drank vintage champagne and spoke of their brilliant future, the world at their feet. Eleanor, meanwhile, was at home. After checking on her sleeping children, their faces serene in the soft glow of their nightlights, she went to her study. The room was immaculate. The hidden computers were powered down, the secret files secured. Her work was done. There was no anxiety, no frantic last-minute preparation. There was only the profound and unsettling stillness of absolute certainty, the kind of quiet that falls over a landscape moments before a hurricane makes landfall. The board was set, the trap was laid, and the king, fat and happy and blind, was about to walk into the checkmate he would never see coming. The air in the room was thick with the echo of Richard's final, dismissive words. "You're useless without my money. What are you going to do? Go back to arranging flowers?" His lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Peterson, smirked in agreement. The mediator looked down at his notes, eager to move things along. They were all waiting for Eleanor's response, expecting the quiet capitulation of a defeated woman. And so they all saw the smile that touched her lips, the same serene, unsettling smile from the beginning of our story. But this time, the smile was not a prelude to silence. It was the curtain rising on the final act. The smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, crystalline purpose. Eleanor's eyes met Mr. Chen's across the table, and she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal, the moment they had choreographed for weeks. Mr. Chen, who had been sitting in quiet observance, rose to his feet. There was no theatricality in his movement, only the grave efficiency of a man about to perform a necessary but unpleasant task. He carried 3 thick, black-bound dossiers. With a soft but decisive thud, he placed one on the polished table in front of Richard's lawyer. He placed a second in front of the stunned mediator. The third he kept for himself. Peterson, Richard's lawyer, scoffed. "If this is some last-ditch attempt to smear my client with personal photos, Mr. Chen, I assure you it is inadmissible and unprofessional." He opened the cover with a dismissive flick of his wrist. His smug expression dissolved as if doused with acid. His eyes widened, his face paling as he scanned the first page. It wasn't a photograph. It was a transcript of a phone call, time-stamped, between Richard and a Dubai official, discussing the specifics of a bribe. He frantically flipped the page. A detailed flowchart of the money trail from the Vance family trust to the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. He kept turning, his breathing growing shallow, seeing screenshots of forged documents, copies of the fraudulent loan application to the Macau lender, printouts of emails between Richard and Sophia detailing their conspiracy. Peterson was no mere divorce lawyer. He was a corporate litigator. He didn't just see evidence of infidelity, he saw racketeering, wire fraud, bank fraud. He saw a dozen federal crimes. He saw years of prison time for the client who sat beside him, grinning like a fool. While Peterson was having his world dismantled by paper and ink, Eleanor made her move. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a checkbook. It was not her personal one with floral patterns. It was a sleek, dark blue business checkbook. Embossed on the leather in simple, gold lettering was a logo he didn't recognize. A stylized bird rising from a circle of flame. A phoenix. The pen in her hand was steady as she wrote. The date, the payee, the amount. Her signature, Eleanor Pierce Vance, was a fluid, confident script he hadn't seen in 15 years. She tore the check from the book with a neat, final rip and slid it across the mahogany table. It glided on the polished surface and came to a perfect stop directly in front of Richard. Richard, momentarily distracted from his lawyer's distress, looked down at the check. The sight of it, combined with his own supreme arrogance, made him laugh. It was a harsh, incredulous sound. "What in God's name is this, Eleanor?" He sneered, picking it up. Are you paying me? Is this some pathetic gesture with your allowance money? My God, you really have lost your mind. Eleanor finally spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of the timid wife he had berated for years. It was the calm, measured, and lethally precise voice of the oracle on the 34th floor. Look at the payee, Richard. He glanced down. The check was made out to Golden Dragon Holdings, Macau. He frowned in confusion. Why would you? And the amount? She continued, her voice unwavering. $30,212,000. The exact principal and interest on the bridge loan you and Sophia fraudulently secured to satisfy the liquidity demand. Richard stared at her, his mind struggling to connect the pieces, a growing dread creeping into his heart. You see, Richard, Eleanor went on, leaning forward ever so slightly, you were right about one thing. I have been busy with a hobby. My hobby is a company I founded, Phoenix Holdings. She gestured to the logo on the checkbook. Phoenix Holdings was the anonymous buyer for your Macau loan. That check is me, closing a bad debt that my company owns, a debt you incurred by committing a felony. Peterson, his face ashen, whispered, Richard, don't say another word. But Richard couldn't hear him. He was staring at Eleanor, at this stranger who wore his wife's face. But that, Eleanor said, her voice dropping, becoming even colder, is just housekeeping, a minor detail. The real issue is Vance's development. She let the name of his company, his life's work, hang in the silent room. You were so worried about a hostile entity called North Star Asset Management, a ghost buyer. You should have been. She paused, letting the final, terrible truth land with the force of a physical blow. North Star is a wholly owned subsidiary of Phoenix Holdings. My company, Richard. For the past 2 months, every mortgage payment you've made, every financial report you've submitted, you've been sending it to me. The blood drained from Richard's face. The smug, arrogant titan was gone, replaced by a man of crumbling stone. And as of this moment, Eleanor concluded, her voice now ringing with the absolute authority of a judge delivering a sentence, based on the clear and irrefutable evidence of criminal fraud presented in those documents, which constitutes a material breach of every covenant in our loan agreement, as your sole creditor, I am calling in the entire loan. Your lines of credit are terminated. Your assets, both personal and corporate, are frozen. You are bankrupt. She stood up, looking down at the broken man who had been her husband. And as for the company you built on my sacrifice and your lies, I am the new majority stakeholder. A board meeting has been called. Your termination is the first item on the agenda. You're fired, Richard. Silence. Peterson frantically, silently, began texting on his phone, no longer a corporate lawyer, but a man seeking a criminal defense specialist. The mediator sat frozen, a stunned witness to the most brutal and elegant execution he had ever seen. And Richard just stared. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His empire, his identity, his future, all of it had been taken from him in the space of 90 seconds by the quiet, useless woman he was about to cast aside. He had tried to take her house, she had taken his world. The implosion of Richard Vance was not loud and explosive, but silent and absolute. He did not scream or rage. He simply collapsed inward, the architecture of his arrogance crumbling into a pile of dust behind his vacant eyes. His lawyer, Peterson, a man paid to project confidence in the face of disaster, was ashen-faced and trembling, his thumbs flying across his phone not in a search for legal loopholes, but for the number of the best criminal defense attorney in the state. The mediation was over. The war was over. And in the silent, debris-strewn aftermath, Eleanor Vance stood alone, the undisputed victor. The consequences for Richard and Sophia were as swift as they were brutal. Armed with the dossiers Eleanor had so meticulously compiled, the district attorney's office moved with surprising speed. The story of the high-flying real estate mogul and his ambitious partner, arrested for a litany of charges ranging from bank fraud to conspiracy, became fodder for the very financial news outlets that had once celebrated his genius. Their carefully constructed social world vanished overnight. Friends disavowed them, boards demanded their resignations, and their names became synonymous with disgrace. Margaret Vance was the last to accept the new reality. A week after the mediation, she appeared at the Greenwich house, her face a mask of regal fury. She came prepared for a battle, ready to unleash a tirade of accusations and insults against the woman who had ruined her perfect son. But the Eleanor who opened the door was not the timid, downtrodden daughter-in-law she had spent 15 years tormenting. This Eleanor was still and calm, her eyes clear and unyielding. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply invited Margaret in, led her to the study, and played a single 30-second audio file. It was Richard, laughing with Sophia, callously detailing his plan to use the family trust as a financial shield, fully prepared to leave Eleanor and his own children bankrupt if his schemes failed. Margaret listened, her rigid posture slowly collapsing as the undeniable sound of her son's treachery filled the room. The fight went out of her, replaced by a horrifying, hollow understanding. She left without another word, a broken woman, finally silenced by the ugly truth. Eleanor's victory was not a signal for celebration, it was a call to work. She assumed control of the newly restructured Vance Development, now a subsidiary of Phoenix Holdings. Her first acts as CEO were not of vengeance, but of restoration. She walked the halls not as a conqueror, but as a builder. She found a company rife with the corruption and cronyism that Richard had fostered. With surgical precision, she began to heal it. The sycophants and yes-men were fired. The talented, hard-working employees whom Richard had overlooked were promoted. She honored the contracts Richard had planned to abandon. She treated the employees with a respect they had never known, and she began to steer the company away from reckless gambles and towards stable, ethical growth. She was not there to burn her husband's empire to the ground. She was there to cleanse it, to rebuild it into something worthy of being a legacy for her children. Several months later, while supervising the final clearing of Richard's cavernous old office in the Polaris Tower, she noticed something her meticulous eye could not ignore. One of the large, built-in mahogany bookshelves was misaligned by a fraction of an inch. A relic of a past life, her analyst's instinct to investigate anomalies took over. She ran her fingers along the edge and felt a small, almost invisible seam. With Mr. Chen's help, they brought in a specialist who, after an hour of work, revealed a hidden wall safe. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities: hidden account numbers, bearer bonds, a final secret from a man of infinite secrets. But when the heavy door swung open, the safe was empty, save for a single, thick, cream-colored envelope, yellowed with age. Her name was written on the front in a familiar, elegant script for Eleanor. It was the handwriting of Richard's late father, Henry Vance Sr. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was dated 6 years prior, just a year before his death. The words inside were a final, shocking revelation, a voice from the grave affirming everything she had been forced to discover on her own. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, it means my son has likely become the man I always feared he would. I love him, but I have never been blind to the hollowness in his heart, the insatiable hunger that mistakes wealth for worth." He wrote of his deep disappointment of watching Richard's moral compass slowly spin away from true north. Then came the final, stunning paragraphs. "I cannot, in good conscience, leave the work of my life, the true heart of this family's legacy, in his reckless hands. Therefore, I have taken steps. The bulk of my personal fortune, the assets I built long before Richard ever laid a single brick, has been placed into a discreet and inviolable trust. A third party manages it, and its sole beneficiaries are you and my precious grandchildren. I trust your character, my dear. I trust your strength and your integrity in a way I could never trust my son's ambition. What Richard has is his to build or to burn, but the true foundation of this family is now in your hands. Protect it, nurture it." Tears, for the first time since this ordeal began, streamed down Eleanor's face. They were not tears of sadness or of anger, but of a profound and startling validation. Her fight had not been a hostile takeover. It had been the fulfillment of a sacred trust, a duty she hadn't even known she had. Months later, she stood in that same office, now her own, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. The world looked different from up here. She had not sought this power, but she would wield it with the wisdom and grace her father-in-law had seen in her. Her journey had been a descent into the deepest betrayal, but it had led her to the highest peak of her own strength. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, for while they are quiet, they are not idle. They are sharpening the sword, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim their world. Thank you for listening. Every family has its secrets, and every silence has a story. We invite you to join us for the next chapter.